Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm bringing you the case of Yuliana Samboni. This is a case that was requested a lot, especially when I mentioned I would be covering Latin American cases, and it's truly terrible. You're gonna feel a sense of helplessness that you probably haven't felt with any other case. So many people ask me to cover it, and I think I understand why. Maybe it's necessary to tell what happened in order to restore a bit of dignity to Juliana and her family. Besides this, I also want to tell you that this is a case that unfolds quickly. Not only did the authorities act very fast, but also the main person responsible for all of this acted within a matter of hours. So you might think that if the case happened and was discovered all in the same day, it would be much easier to explain and solve. However, that's not the case, and we're going to see why. Or at least it wasn't at that moment. Now we have all the answers, or at least most of the things we wondered about when we first heard about everything that happened. Make yourselves comfortable, because we're going to be here for a while going over this whole case, since there are quite a few things to discuss. There are videos, several news stories we need to highlight, and 2 different trials. So get comfortable, grab something to eat, something to drink, and listen to this case. All of this happened in Colombia in 2016, but it wasn't until 2019 that all the legal proceedings finally ended. So now we can finally talk about all of this. Up here on the eye on the screen, there's a playlist of all my cases on this channel if you want to keep watching, and if you like how I tell stories, how I make the videos, and so on. Down here are my social media links in case you want to follow me on any of them, to learn more about the videos, see pictures of my cat, and so on. All that kind of stuff. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started with the minio. The little girl you're seeing right now is Juliana Andrea Zamboni, born on June 26, 2009. At this time, she was a very happy child. According to her father, even at her young age of 7, she already had aspirations. She used to play pretend, wanting to be a doctor, a queen. She was very close to her family and told them everything. Juliana had just finished kindergarten in El Tambo, the place where she spent the first 5 years of her life. Her father speaks about her with a lot of affection. He worked very hard to be able to give her everything she needed, to get her the little things she wanted. In this house, Juliana grew up with her sister Nicole and their 2 parents, Juvencio and Nellie. They lived in a low-income neighborhood, in a house that was way too small for the number of people living there. Juliana's parents decided that the best thing they could do to improve their situation was to move somewhere else in search of more work and better opportunities. That's how they ended up in the city of Bogota. Juvencio worked at whatever job he could find. Up until the day of the incident, he had a job in construction. He had managed to get a pretty steady job at a construction company. Juliana's mother worked cleaning and took whatever jobs were available. This little house I'm showing you now was in Bogota, Colombia, specifically in the Bosque Calderon neighborhood. The family had been dealing with a big problem with the crops at their previous location. They lived in a place where the pay wasn't done, and the conditions they lived in weren't enough to raise a family. They came to Bogota looking, as I said before, for a better life. At this point, before everything happened, they seemed to have a very peaceful life. Things were getting better, they were working. It seemed to them that they had managed to escape any problems they had before. The family in Bogota was big. Since they were living at their uncle's house before, Juliana and her sister lived together with their cousins, who also talk about how they used to live. This family wanted to buy a house that would give them a better life, so that Juliana and her sister could get a good education, so they could have everything their parents wished for them. It's also worth mentioning that this family is what is known as Yanacona, an ethnic group that might later be important to understand the reasoning the parents used at the end of the case, after the trial. But anyway, that's all I can say for now. Let's remember that the girl was only 7 years old, so I don't have much more to tell you. There's not much else to go into since we're talking about a little girl. We can really only talk about her family and everything they did to get to this place, to have a better life, thinking that in this new city, they could really have a bright future. So let's get straight to the fact. All of this begins on December 4th, 2016, when Juliana was only 7 years old. The little girl was outside her house, in her neighborhood, playing with her little cousin near the highway. All of this happened very early in the morning. Remember, as I said before, this takes place throughout the day, and the beginning of this story happens very early. Everything seemed fine. She was playing like always, until a silver Nissan SUV, an X-Trail model, stopped in front of him. A man got out of the SUV and asked Juliana and her cousin if they knew a certain address. He asked them if they knew how to get there. The thing is, Juliana didn't really know the area. She hadn't lived there that long, plus she was only 7 years old, and her cousin didn't know either, so they told him no. They insisted that they didn't know anything about that address, and the man asked them to come a little closer to look at the paper he was holding with the address on it. At that moment, she walked up to the car to get a better look at the address he had, and the man took her. You can actually see on a security camera how the van pulls up to where she was playing, and a man gets out, only to get back in seconds later and drive off with her. You can even see the car getting closer to the camera that's recording it. Little by little, it gets close there and then drives away from the scene. So we have a close-up of the van, which was very helpful in this case. Immediately, Yuliana's cousin ran inside the house and told her parents what had just happened. He was clearly desperate, so the parents didn't hesitate to go outside to see if the car was still there. It was already gone. The first thing they did after confirming the car was gone was call the police, who actually responded pretty quickly. That's something I have to point out, since it's not common for the police to act so fast. But since this was a case involving a little girl, it's understandable. The protocol isn't the same as with an adult. The thing is, this whole case is basically a chase. All day long they were tracking this SUV and the person responsible for the kidnapping. Even though they had plenty of ways to keep tabs on this person, the police probably couldn't have prevented what eventually happened. Like I said before, you could see the SUV on the cameras, which led them to conclude that this person had passed through the same place 2 other times, on 2 different days. All the close surveillance, what happened, we know from the neighbors' testimonies. The first time the SUV approached, the man inside offered Juliana money to get her to come closer. We even found out that this person tried to grab her, that he had her by the hands, and that she managed to break free. The second time he came back, but this time Juliana was playing with her friends, so instead of just leaving, he decided to invite all of them into the car. He wanted all the kids to get into the SUV. Obviously, the kids didn't do it, he couldn't get what he wanted, so he left. And then he came back a third time, and that's when he managed to take her. It was then concluded that this man had been planning this, and that he had clearly spent days with the same plan to take the same person. Or maybe to take another child or several children from the same area. We can deduce that he probably didn't feel any fear either. He didn't see any risk in his mind about what could happen. Going to the same place 3 times, he clearly felt like nothing could happen to him. That nothing bad could happen. We'll see later why this person might have thought there was no risk in kidnapping children from this place. It's also thanks to these recordings that we were able to find out the license plate of the truck, which was DBO 960. With that, they were able to find out the name of the owner of the Nissan. The truck was registered under the name of Francisco Uribe Noguera's wife, whom the police quickly contacted. The police called Francisco, and he seemed completely confused. He didn't know what was going on and didn't understand why they would be calling him about the truck. So what they did was summon him so they could better explain everything that had happened. When he met with the officers, they explained to him that the Nissan truck, which was registered in his wife's name, had been used in a kidnapping. It's unclear whether he was pretending not to know or if he truly didn't understand what was happening, but he says, thankfully at that moment, that he didn't know exactly who was driving that truck. Francisco explains to the officers that actually the truck belonged to the family and that there wasn't just one person who drove it. This meant that it was also used by his 2 brothers. The police then start trying to contact his brothers to see what was going on, to find out if any of them knew anything. which ends up being a waste of time, since after a while of investigating, Francisco contacts them and tells them that actually the one who was driving the car was his brother. I think it's important to point out here that the family was powerful. They had money, they had good jobs, and all of them had graduated from college. They were well off. And this is exactly what may have made the person who kidnapped Juliana think that he was above the law, that he could probably get away with this without going to jail. On top of everything, his brother Francisco was a well-known lawyer, so maybe all of this, his family having a lot of money, his brother being a lawyer, working for an important firm, made him believe that he could really get away with kidnapping a girl from a poor background. I mentioned 3 siblings for the following reason. Not only Francisco and Rafael are involved, but also their sister Catalina Uribe Noguera. So let's see what happens during the rest of the morning and afternoon. Once Francisco confirms that his brother was the one driving the SUV, the one behind the wheel, and the one who had possibly kidnapped someone, he goes with the police to Rafael's apartment, but they don't find him there. Fortunately, the doorman had seen the SUV circling the building a few times. Let's just say it was so many times that it seemed out of the ordinary to him. All of this was happening since the early hours of the morning. At this point, Francisco separates from the police, and they start searching for Rafael everywhere. For hours, they don't get a single piece of news about his whereabouts or where he could be. Until suddenly, around 5 in the afternoon, Francisco calls them again and gives them some rather disturbing news. First, he tells them that he was heading to the emergency room with his brother because his health was in a very serious condition. The officers enter the hospital and realize that Francisco isn't letting them see his brother, saying that his condition is so severe that he can't allow it. He tells them they can't go in, calls his lawyer for a while, and later tells them the truth. He tells the officers that Rafael had actually killed Juliana, but that it had all been an accident. Let's just say that from this point on, when the media found out about all this and who the culprit or supposed culprit was up to that moment, people really thought Rafael was going to get away with it, that he wouldn't spend any time in prison, mostly because there are so many cases like this where wealthy people simply don't pay for what they've done. On top of everything, up until that point, it even seemed like his brother was covering for him. Like Francisco was planning everything so the police wouldn't catch him, to delay the trial, to keep him from facing justice. But anyway, we'll get into that later, so hold on to your opinions so we can have a good discussion at the end. Francisco told the police that Rafael had told him the girl's body was in the EQS 66 building, in apartment 603, in a jacuzzi. So then Francisco went with the police to this apartment in EQS 66. When they arrived at the duplex, which actually belonged to his mother, they found the first floor to be dirty. This apartment didn't have any furniture, since in fact no one was living there at the time, and there was oil all over the floor. It was everywhere, on the floor, on the stairs, and on the second floor too. There were also cigarette butts and a few bottles of alcohol. So then, they went up to the second floor where the jacuzzi was. And let me tell ya, the girl wasn't in it, but underneath it. This jacuzzi had a space underneath it about 60 centimeters high. That's where the machinery went, along with a few other things that belonged under the jacuzzi. She was inside that space, under the jacuzzi. She wasn't wearing any clothes and was covered in oil, just like the rest of the apartment. But what still shocks people the most to this day, and what is still so hard to talk about even now, years have gone by, and it's still one of the things that has impacted me the most in a case because of the cruelty. On top of her body, there was a stuffed animal, as if it were a prize or a gift, as if everything he did was something to be admired, like it was something he wanted to do. It was an achievement, and every time I went back to review the case, every time I got to this part, it kept giving me the same feeling, that everything he had already done wasn't enough. He had to leave a sign of even greater disrespect. That was it. He was already at the limit, and he crossed it. It didn't seem like enough to him. The girl's clothes were found in the tank of a toilet in the bathroom, which clearly also meant he wanted to make the clothes disappear. Oil, too, for those who don't know, can erase some traces of the crime. It can erase signs of abuse, or rather, not erase them, but hide signs of abuse, or other kinds of marks. So obviously, he had tried to hide everything that had happened. The person responsible for all this was clearly Raphael. He himself admitted it later at the prosecutor's office. So they went to the hospital and read him all of his charges in full. And from there, the justice system took action, which we'll look at later. He had kidnapped, abused, and murdered the girl, and later tried to cover up the evidence with oil. So he had committed so many crimes that you would definitely think he'd spend his whole life in prison. But just to make something clear, the maximum sentence in Colombia, at least at that time, was 60 years. So what happens then? It's not exactly a life sentence. And it also wasn't what most people were asking for, nor what the parents deserved. But anyway, that's what was available at the time, and that's what they tried to enforce. The problem with this is that the first sentence he received was only 45 years. He was 15 years short of reaching 60, and that seemed pretty unfair. So the prosecution then requested the maximum sentence, and he ended up getting 58 years. But anyway, let's move on to some of the most important details from the autopsy. First of all, the body was covered in oil, so it was hard to run tests, but they managed to do it. They found traces of Raphael's DNA, which confirmed not only abuse, but also clearly showed that he was responsible. The girl also had bite marks on her face. Finally, it's important to mention that the cause of death was asphyxiation and suffocation, which means that not only did he try to strangle her, but he also covered her airways. But now we need to discuss a small issue that lasted until this year, until August 2019, and that is whether the brothers had anything to do with it or not, if they knew about all of this, if they helped hide the evidence, what they did, and if they were really involved in this case. A big part of this issue was based on Francisco's behavior and the cameras at Ica 66. Aside from certain text messages exchanged between the brothers and the family, first of all, we need to talk about the videos and the exact times when they entered the place. It's clear that Francisco contacted the police before 2 o'clock and later called them to say he was taking his brother to the hospital at 5. So there's a period during which he didn't tell the police that he knew where Raphael was. It's this period that we're going to be reviewing on the security cameras. On Sunday, February 4th at 3:32 p.m., Catalina Noguera is seen arriving at the building, and 10 minutes later, Francisco is seen entering behind her. At 3:46 in the afternoon, you can see Francisco arriving on the rooftop and jumping over a wall to get into the duplex. As I mentioned before, the duplex had a jacuzzi and was therefore on the top floor of the building, which was actually the rooftop, and the rooftop was divided by some walls. He just jumps over that wall. You can see it clearly on the camera. It's super close. You can see his face, you can see everything. And then the last thing you see is them leaving the building 2 to 3 hours later. In other words, at this point, when he gets to the duplex by climbing over the wall, he already knew something had happened. It was no longer just the police looking for him because of an alleged kidnapping. Now he had arrived at the building and found the car. Before going up, he asks the doorman where the SUV was. It wasn't in its usual spot. It was in the basement. Not only did he find this strange, but when he went to open the car once downstairs, he found a shoe. A child's shoe, let's say, a kid's shoe, according to him. At that moment, everything stopped. In other words, everything changed for him. His sense of what was happening completely flipped. However, right then, he decides that the first thing he needs to do is find his brother to clear up everything that was going on. And only then does he go up to the duplex and cross the wall. Francisco comes down from the second floor where the jacuzzi was, sees that there was oil everywhere, climbs into the jacuzzi, since he couldn't just enter the house, and from there starts talking to his sister, who was listening to him from the door on the first floor, since she hadn't been able to get into the duplex. They talk for a while, she could smell cigarette smoke, and since she couldn't get in because the door was obviously stuck, Francisco decides to jump down from the second floor, carefully, and make his way to the first floor. On the first floor, like I said before, there was no furniture or anything because nobody lived there. However, by the time he got there, the whole place was already covered in oil, which for some reason didn't seem all that strange to him, since according to him, his brother had addiction problems and was also an alcoholic, and sometimes did things like that. That's something I need you to remember, because, anyway, it seems to me like it's a lie to try to downplay what he did. But anyway, let's continue. On the first floor, he finds his brother in a room with a balcony facing outside, trying to jump. That's when he stops him and starts questioning him, asking where the girl was and what he had done with her. He wanted to know, he wanted to confirm everything that was happening. Francisco implies that all the oil, the cigarettes, the alcohol were already there before he arrived. That all of that had been done directly by Raphael and that he had nothing to do with it. Despite the questioning, Raphael didn't want to tell him anything. He didn't tell him what he had done with the girl, he didn't say what he had done with the clothes, or why he had poured oil everywhere. Until Francisco insisted enough for him to say that the girl was dead and that it had been an accident. That actually she had jumped out of the comm. However, this was a contradiction. When he started talking, he told different stories. At first, that something else had happened to the girl, then that she jumped out of the car, but that it was still an accident. So Francisco, fed up with everything that was happening, finally lets his sister in, who was apparently crying and very worried. She goes into the apartment and starts looking for the girl everywhere, hoping she was alive and hiding somewhere. The main issue that needs to be discussed here, despite everything that might seem suspicious, is that Francisco called his lawyers instead of calling the police directly when he had been communicating with them before. I mean, he could have just called the officers directly, or at least called 911 and said he had the possible killer of a little girl. What he did was call some colleagues and his lawyer directly. However, looking at it from a lawyer's point of view, I'd say that's the normal procedure. Obviously there was going to be a trial, and obviously his brother was guilty of something. At that moment, according to him, he didn't know exactly what or how everything had happened, but he did know there would be a trial, that he would need a lawyer, and all that. It's common procedure to call the defense. However, for many people, it would have been right to just call the police directly, since, let's say, nothing could be avoided. He had lied, he was lying at that moment. He had hidden a body, he had hidden evidence, he had tried to cover up all traces of what he had done with oil. And besides, he had tried to throw himself off the apartment afterward. So, maybe it would have been wise to just call the police right away. Plus, they were in there for 3 hours. He received criticism and still gets criticized to this day for this very reason. But let's talk a bit about the messages exchanged within the family. There were many that didn't really imply much. It didn't mean they were guilty of all this or that they had actually tried to help Raphael at that moment. But they deleted the messages that had to do with this, so that's the part that is the most intriguing. On WhatsApp, Catalina and her mother argued a bit about what was happening with Raphael before they could go in. Catalina wrote the following to her mother. I called him 11 times and he didn't answer, and then he turned off his phone. Francisco came in through the terrace of the EQ66 apartment. He's inside, and I'm waiting for him to open the door for me or say something. And it's after finding him, after already being at the hospital, that she says the following to her. I told him not to take the pills, for his heart. Her mother replies, perfect. Tell him that we love him so much that he should only think about himself. The best thing for us is for him to stop suffering. Tell him that we love him and we always love. Catalina replies, I already told him he wants to die, Mom. I don't know what to do to help him. Her mother says, let him be. And Catalina finishes with the following, yes. But here, they won't let him. They forced him to take the heart pills. They were clearly talking about how this man could very well die, that they loved him, and that they would rather his pain ended, in big quotation marks, so to speak. For them, for some reason, he was suffering. But there's something I think is important to start discussing right now, because later on, they're put on trial precisely for everything I just mentioned. And I think, given all these things, that the siblings weren't really involved. In this situation, that they didn't know what Raphael was doing. Maybe because of all the years they lived together, because they were family, they knew he was up to something weird. They probably knew he wasn't very normal, that he had something strange going on, but that doesn't mean they were involved in this case, or that they actually tried to cover it up. Think about it this way. The police call Francisco's wife to tell her that their truck was involved in something related to a kidnapping. So Francisco gets in touch with them, and they talk about the truck and who actually owns it or who was driving it. He finds out, after talking with his family, that his brother was the last one to have the Nissan. According to his account, he was talking to the police. He was with them when he got the call that Raphael was probably in this building. So he leaves without saying goodbye to the police or anything to try to check if his brother was really there and if something was actually happening or to find out what was going on. He goes to the building, checks where the car is, goes down to where the car is, and goes up, seeing the little girl's shoe. Keeping that in mind, he gets to the apartment, goes in. Nobody wanted to open the door for him, so he breaks into the duplex and sees his brother lying there. He then opens the apartment door for his sister, who was also worried. She starts searching everywhere, and they spend some time talking about what just happened. Keep in mind that it took quite a while before he was able to get into the apartment, so out of those 3 hours or 2.5 hours they spent there, part of that time was just spent trying to get inside. What I'm saying is that if they were expecting this to happen, since they had money and Francisco was a lawyer, they would have already had everything ready. They wouldn't have shown up at the building, they wouldn't have appeared on the cameras, they wouldn't have been implicated, nor would they have been implicated. Because, obviously, that made them look a bit more guilty. I mean, the way all of this happened makes me think that even though they probably tried to talk to Raphael inside the building and tried to see if they could solve the whole problem, they either decided not to or just didn't end up covering it up. In other words, everything had already been done. He had poured oil everywhere, he had obviously killed the girl, he had done a bunch of things that just couldn't be defended anymore. So they just argued for a while, went into the apartment, and then left. He only had 2 options, either go straight to the police or go into the apartment to check if his brother was there and if all of this was true, or just see what was going on. Let's say he chose to follow the impulse to go to the duplex, go inside, and see for himself, even though there was a risk of disturbing the scene. Many people argue that it seems obvious Francisco had some kind of plan from the start, that he had been hiding details from the police since the morning they started looking for him. But that's only half true because, in the end, he always ended up telling everything he knew. He finds out that his brother was driving the truck and he tells the police. He goes to the apartment, doesn't tell the police, but once they go to the hospital, supposedly for his brother's health, he informs the police. We can't even say that they tried to hide the girl's clothes with her brother, or that they were the ones who came up with the idea of the oil or the ammonia, because you can see Raphael on the street cameras going to a supermarket and coming back. With all the things that are in the apartment, with the oil, with the ammonia, and even the cashier, by the way, an important detail, says that he didn't seem strange at all. She says he wasn't acting strange at all. In other words, she wasn't really sure that he was intoxicated in any way. But anyway, that's another theory. Obviously, the siblings were gonna go to trial for being involved in all of this in some way. And this is the part one I want to discuss. Maybe y'all have a different kind of hypothesis, but the main one that was considered was that the siblings might have tried to justify what he did by saying he was completely intoxicated, that he had substance abuse problems, and that he was drunk. This hypothesis suggests that maybe when they got to the place, the brother wasn't actually intoxicated at all, that he was completely in his right mind. So it's said that maybe they did try to intoxicate him to take him to the hospital, or maybe they just had a contact inside the hospital and got him in there so the police couldn't get to him because he was in critical condition. Essentially, they were just buying him a little time, but not much. But that's where the problem lies, basically, because they didn't have much extra time. This whole thing about being intoxicated, having fragile health, didn't really do much, except buy him a little time until the police arrived and read him all the charges against him. So you can see on the security cameras that they take him to the psychiatric hospital, saying at the time that it was best to take him there because of the substances he had supposedly ingested. And then you see them leave the building and go away. It's while they're on their way that Raphael actually tells him what he had done, that he had killed her, and that's when Francisco calls the police. There's one more detail before we move on to the rest of the events. The building's doorman, who was obviously a witness, committed suicide a week after the incident. His name was Fernando Merchon, and it was said that this person, who had seen the van driving around, who had seen the brothers go in and come out, actually hadn't committed suicide but had been killed. That someone made that murder look like a suicide, since no one could believe that someone who had so much to say about the case would suddenly disappear, that he would take his own life. But it makes sense. You see, this man left a letter addressed to his daughters saying that he was innocent. You might wonder, if he was innocent, why did he decide to do this? And it's probably because he thought they were going to use him as a scapegoat. meaning they would use him as someone who was actually innocent but would be declared guilty, or that the evidence in the apartment would make him look guilty. Because this is what happens in these kinds of cases with people who have a lot of power. Sometimes they use people who are close to the scene, who don't have much money to defend themselves, no lawyers, nothing, to blame him for the crimes. He probably thought this was gonna happen, even though he was innocent. Keep in mind that at that time, this doorman didn't have any charges against him. There was nothing directly accusing him of being responsible for what happened to Yuliana. But something must have pressured him enough to feel like they were gonna make him the scapegoat. Thank you. That they were gonna pin him as the one responsible for this case.
Raphael Merchant would have been an accomplice. Merchant, just a few days after the death of little Juliana, took his own life. But
doorman or the security guard called me, telling me that she was downstairs wanting to come up. And I told the guard to please not let her up and to tell anyone who came to the apartment that I wasn't there.
During that week when he was still alive, the question is, did something happen? Did something happen to him with someone that made him feel in danger? This makes me think that the Noguera family must have threatened him or offered him money, and so he was already saw coming what was going to happen to him. And that's why he ultimately decided to take his own life. There really wasn't much more evidence needed to show that Raphael had obviously done it. Despite the oil, they were able to recover DNA that proved he was entirely responsible for this death. Also, he had hidden the clothes, the shoe was found in the car, the camera showed him, and there were more than 25 testimonial pieces of evidence. Some of those were actually from children who were around the neighborhood while he was taking Juliana. In fact, thanks to the cameras, they were also able to trace the route he took with the car, where you could see Juliana from time to time while she was still alive, up until the moment when she was already unconscious.
It's the same camera that caught the SUV leaving at 9:20, which complements the perspective from the other video device. The new angle is what allows you to see the girl inside the car between 9:41, when they entered the parking lot, and 9:44, the time they left again.
He even confessed to the prosecutor's office that he was guilty. The big question in all of this was how he knew about the oil, how he knew that it could hide evidence. Had he received advice from someone? That's where the fact that his brother was a lawyer comes in. Maybe some people thought he would know about the oil and would have told him. The thing is, as we saw before, he had already gone to buy it before Francisco arrived at the building. There is also something unusual. The police, the two officers who had arrived at the scene with Francisco, stayed there for 2 hours instead of calling other officers or requesting an official review, bringing in the forensics team and everything else as protocol required. They stayed there for 2 hours, which led investigators to have to check computers and cell phones to try to see if other people were involved, or if there was a child trafficking ring. It was thought that maybe there was a ring involved, simply because they believed Raphael couldn't have acted alone, that everything he did couldn't have been done in the state he was supposedly in. Maybe there was even a trafficking ring near where Juliana and her family lived.
Later, I changed my story and told him that the girl had gotten off at some bridges on 65th and Sipambular. He kept asking me over and over where she was, telling me he hoped that girl would show up, that I should pray for that girl to show up, and then I changed my story again and said that she had jumped.
he stated in his testimony, given from La Tramuca prison in Valledupar via escape, that he lied to his brother Francisco the whole time about the whereabouts of the girl on the afternoon of December 4th, 2016.
The defendants, Catalina and Francisco Jose Uribe Noguera, that is, for the crime of aiding and abetting in conjunction with concealment, alteration, or destruction of material evidence, are acquitted.
We repeat, the siblings Francisco and Catalina Uribe Noguera were acquitted in the case of little Yuliana Samboni.
Even though the trial against Raphael was held and there was a sentence, the family refused to accept any financial compensation. Many people wondered why. And this has a lot to do with the ethnicity I mentioned at the beginning. They had beliefs that didn't allow them to take that money. They believed that under no circumstances should money be made from children, or this very thing that was happening to them. They decided not to take the money and to continue with their jobs and their lives as they were. Which brings me to the conclusion and to how things have been since then. What happened after those events? In 2017, Juliana's brother was born, named Juliana. Juliana and Dress, keep in mind that during pregnancies, it's usually advised not to experience stress, to try not to get too stressed, to try not to go through bad moments. And unfortunately for Nellie, this was not easy at all. She was in the middle of all this, the trials, the whole case, which probably didn't allow her to be in good health. Still, Juliana's brother was born healthy, he's fine. At first, he had some respiratory problems, as far as I know, but the family is doing well. These days, they're still trying to follow through with what they had planned before, still trying to be able to buy a house so they can support the family and, let's say, move on with their lives, despite what happened to them. So, well, nothing more to add. Obviously, my best wishes to the family. This was truly unfortunate. Something else I want to add is that Raphael is supposedly having a really hard time in prison because obviously the other inmates don't like him. In fact, they try to kill him several times from what I understand, and they have to keep him somewhat separated from the other inmates. But anyway, this is where the video ends. Please, let me know what you think down in the comments. What do you think about the siblings? Were Francisco and Catalina involved in any way? Did they know about Raphael's tendencies? Did they know what he wanted to do? Did they have a feeling about what he was going to do? Did they have any idea that he was planning to take someone? Did they really try to cover for their brother? Let me know down in the comments. Let's start a discussion, because this can't be forgotten. Nothing else to add. Over here on the side are my Patreons. Thank you all so much for supporting me through that platform. I truly appreciate it. Down below, you'll find the link in the description if you want to know more about it, if you want to know what Patreon is or how to support me through that page. On another note, thanks to everyone who watches me on YouTube. I really appreciate it because you're actually supporting me in both ways. Even if you're a Patreon, if you're just on YouTube, if you comment, hit like, that's supporting me. Watching the videos is supporting me. So thank you. I hope you enjoy Latin American Cases Week. We're already at 3 videos, I think, so let's keep going. Keep recommending things to me because I still haven't picked the last ones for next week, so send them in, please, because I'll be working on videos all week. Oh, and I almost forgot, if you have any Christmas cases you want to recommend, leave them down below in the comments. It's really, really important. With nothing more to say, this is where the video ends. Here you have a new video, and here's a recommended video. You can subscribe by clicking on my face. And I'll see you in another video. Goodbye.